Ukraine and Russia are two countries that border each other in Eastern Europe. On February 24, 2022, Russia sent its army into Ukraine and began trying to take over the country by force. This invasion surprised many people, as it was the first major war in Europe for decades. But Russia and Ukraine have had a difficult relationship for centuries. To understand what's happening now, you have to dig into 1,300 years of history. Both countries trace their beginnings to the same medieval kingdom, called Kievan-Rus. It was founded in the 800s by a group of Vikings, the Varangians, who came from northern Europe to rule over the local people. Kievan-Rus spanned what is now Russia and Ukraine, and its people, the Slavs, are the ancestors of today's Russians and Ukrainians. Its capital was the city of Kiev, the same Kiev that is now the capital of Ukraine. Moscow, the capital of today's Russia, was also part of Kievan-Rus. Kievan-Rus was conquered by Mongol armies from Asia in 1240 and split up. Kiev became part of a new commonwealth that spanned today's Poland and Ukraine. Moscow became the local capital of the Mongol Empire. Both Moscow and Kiev were at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, but with different cultures based on their geography. In the 1500s, descendants of the Kievan-Rus princes in Moscow formed an empire of their own, Imperial Russia. By 1654, it included Kiev and its Ukrainian peoples along with other lands and people from Europe and Asia. In Imperial Russia, some saw Ukrainians as brothers to the Russians because they shared a culture dating back to medieval times. But Ukrainians said that while both groups practiced the same religion and shared some history, Ukrainian culture, such as its food, language, art and music, was different. It was shaped by contact with different peoples and a history different from Russia's. A revolution in February 1917 forced Russia's leader, Tsar Nicholas II, from the throne. Another revolution that same year created a new empire called the Soviet Union. Some Ukrainians didn't want to join the new Soviet Empire. They tried to form their own country, but the Soviets defeated their movement and created the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic instead, one of a number of republics that made up the Union. At first, it allowed Ukrainians to keep their culture and run their local government, but when the Soviets began to fear that Ukrainians wanted independence, they took their power away. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine and Russia, which both had been part of the Soviet Union, became independent countries. Fast forward to 2013, Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, wanted Ukraine to be loyal to Russia, so he decided not to sign a trade agreement to bring Ukraine closer to Europe. Ukrainians protested, kicked Yanukovych out of office, and elected a government that favored Europe rather than Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed that despite these protests, most Ukrainians wanted ties with Russia. He also worried that Ukraine would join a military alliance with the US and Europe that would be a threat to Russia. In 2014, Russia took over an area in southern Ukraine called Crimea. It also sent soldiers and weapons to eastern Ukraine, claiming to be helping people who wanted to be part of Russia. In the 8 years since then, about 14,000 people have died, and 1 million people have fled to escape the fighting. As Russia prepared to invade in February, President Vladimir Putin tore up an unfulfilled 2015 Minsk peace deal and accused NATO of threatening his historic future as a nation, claiming without foundation that NATO countries wanted to bring the war to Crimea. He has lately accused NATO of using Ukraine to wage a proxy war against Russia. For Russia's leader, the West's 30-member defensive military alliance has one aim: to split society in Russia and ultimately destroy it. In a Victory Day speech on the 9th of May, he accused NATO of launching an active military buildup on territories adjacent to Russia. Ahead of the war, he demanded that NATO turn the clock back to 1997 and reverse its eastward expansion, removing its forces and military infrastructure from member states that joined the alliance in 1997 and not deploying strike weapons near Russia's borders. That means Central Europe, Eastern Europe and the Baltics. In President Putin's eyes, The West promised back in 1990 that NATO would expand not an inch to the east, but did so anyway. That was before the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, so the promise made to then Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev only referred to East Germany in the context of a reunified Germany. Mr. Gorbachev said later that the topic of NATO expansion was never discussed at the time. But President Putin's ambition to roll NATO back to the late 1990s has taken a hit, with Finland and Sweden looking closely at joining an alliance that now seems as unified as ever. Russia has already punished 2 NATO members, Poland and Bulgaria, for the West's support for Ukraine, by cutting off their gas supplies. Ukrainians are now fighting the Russian army, trying to defeat what they say is an occupation.